But now I know what some of you are probably wondering, and that is, what are some of the things that have poor SFRs? And that is the last thing I'm going to be teaching you here in this class, is things that commonly have very poor SFRs that you need to watch out for and be cautious about and evaluate when you are doing them. All right. The first and foremost thing, of course, are the heaviest lifts. So doing things like deadlifts, heavy squats, and any sort of strength training, and especially powerlifting. Basically, the heavier you go, the worse the SFR is. All right. Next is high volume training, of course, especially junk volume or superfluous sets that aren't really helping you and you're just throwing in there for whatever bad reason, and any workouts that are excessively long, that take over an hour and a half. Unless you're doing very light, low impact endurance training where you're really pacing yourself, or doing some sort of specialized sports training protocols. Generally speaking, long workouts are extremely exhausting and fatiguing, and just things that need to be cut down. Your workout should be under an hour and a half long, or about an hour and a half long tops. If you have good reason for it to be about that long, you could make it work, but you do have to watch out for the fatigue that starts to occur and will start to turn into burnout. Right? And basically, the longer the workout, the more fatiguing it is, and the worse the SFR. Next, number 3 is training to and past failure. Doing drop sets and other types of failure training have poor SFRs, which is why you should only be doing them at the end of a block of progressive overload before a week of rest and recovery. You never train to or especially past failure for any number of weeks in a row. All right, you do that at the very end of your cycle for 1 to 2 weeks tops. Maybe at most do 1 week where you train to failure, and then 1 week where you train past it. But you never do more than that. You never do 2 for both, or anything more than that too. Usually, it would just be 1 week of going to and past failure all in 1 week. So you wouldn't want to do failure training more than that. And anyone who says that they do or trains to failure all the time is either mistaken, or is lying, or are on steroids, which helps with the recovery. All right, but I don't recommend that. So saving failure training for the end of your block of progressive overload is great, but you don't do it more than that because it has such a high SFR. The next is any type of sets where you are limiting the rest periods between sets. So rest pause sets and cluster sets, supersets, giant sets, even circuits and intervals are going to have a very bad SFR, because when you reduce and limit or eliminate altogether the recovery time between sets, that rest period was for you to recover from fatigue that had been developed by that exercise, that set. All right, and that's why we need different types of rest periods between different types of sets, because different ones are fatiguing in different amounts. And when you're doing little to no rest period, that fatigue has nowhere to go. You're not recovering from the fatigue set to set. So for instance, if you do a full body circuit where you do one exercise for every muscle as quickly as you can, even though each muscle has performed the lowest possible volume of just one set, that's extremely exhausting, right? Especially if you've been trying to get it done quickly as a circuit is supposed to be done, and then you do multiple of those circuits. Well, you may have only done 3 sets for every muscle, which is still a very low volume. But since you just did 30 or 36, however many exercises you did altogether as fast as you can, you have just really exhausted your system. And you've done so without giving each individual muscle very much stimulus. So notice how the fatigue caused by doing these circuits using this format is exponential to the amount of stimulus. Your muscles have not actually been stimulated that much, and yet you've caused this extremely exponential amount of fatigue. That's because normally when you have those rests in between sets, you are cutting that fatigue and recovering from it with that rest time. So without that, you're going to accumulate huge amounts of fatigue, just like this. So that's generally why we save things like giant sets for the end of a block of progressive overload again. And when we're doing things like supersets or cluster sets, rest pause sets, and interval training, there's specific ways of doing it and protocols involved that we use in order to manage our energies properly. All right, and that is what makes it so important. We know what trade-offs there are and how to balance our energy expenditures and basically allocate our ergonomic resources a bit differently here. So what we do is we will do lower impact training, lighter sets, and use a lower RPE, right? So that we're conserving our energies a little bit in each working set, and that gives us the ability to cut down on the rest periods. All right, so you want to be making sure you spread your energies out and modulate them across your ergonomic resources correctly. And that brings me to the next one, number 5, which is basically a similar thing. It's on the same token but the other side, and that is low frequency splits with a high per session volume that basically do the opposite, where you pile on a whole week's worth of volume into one muscle into one training session and are just doing a huge number of sets for one muscle all at once. And then conversely, you are giving it a whole week to rest between it getting worked again. This is the opposite to doing a circuit or interval where you do the full body and only one set per muscle. And neither one of those is a good SFR, right? They both have bad SFRs because of how you are spreading your volume in such an extreme way, in one way or the other. So by the same token, doing all of your volume for the week for one muscle all at once is a really bad idea. It has a very poor SFR. So things such as bro splits just aren't good for you. They're not good for your body. You're overtraining your muscle one day and then undertraining it for 6 and giving it too much rest and recovery. One thing is overtraining it and putting you into this ergonomic debt. And then the rest of the time, you're giving it too much rest and recovery, which is also negative in that you're able to, of course, heal all the fatigue, but it's then too much time, so you're getting weak. So you never want to do too much per session volume or too much for one muscle on any one day. Both of those have a low SFR. So you want to find a split that does the job a split is supposed to do by spreading your training volume, the volume you're working with at that time, across the optimal frequency. So if you want to learn more about splits and how to do that, you can watch my class on training splits at the end of part 4, the technique part. And if you want to learn more about volume and frequency, that's what I covered at the end of the last part, so make sure you have seen my video on that. Otherwise, moving on. The next is intensity techniques and tactics and high intensity types of training. Everything you learned about when I taught you intensity techniques and such for progressive overload in the last part was stuff you should mainly be focusing on again at the end of your block of progressive overload when you have a week of rest and recovery afterwards. And if you're doing a totally high intensity training method, like HIIT, high intensity interval training, then you need to be doing things to manage your fatigue. Okay. Now the next is when you are doing hypertrophy training and moving into the realm of endurance training and basically trying to find a middle ground or do both. So you're doing a high volume of high rep sets. You have to understand that when people do endurance training for a marathon or some sort of race or event, where they are going to be exercising endurance for hours, they are really modulating their energies and pacing themselves throughout their training sessions to be able to, run that far, bike that far, or whatever it may be. Okay, but when you are training for hypertrophy and then you start to move into endurance training, and you are doing, a large number of extremely high rep sets with weights, that can be extremely exhausting to your system because it's not as low impact, and your system is just not going to be able to modulate it as much. You're not going to be able to pace yourself because you're not spreading out your energies as much. So for instance, I know some bodybuilders who will do sets of 100 reps and do multiple sets of them, so that, just for one exercise, they're doing hundreds of reps of the same movement pattern. And then they're not just doing that movement pattern in that session, they're doing multiple movement patterns, so they're doing hundreds of reps for each, so that equals thousands of reps, and that's something that is going to be extremely fatiguing and have a bad SFR and really needs some very specific strategy in order to make it work, in order to properly modulate your energies and spread them out across all of the different sets in the session and make sure you're not going into a deficit or into debt and overtraining. And this is something that people do when they're doing sports training, and it gets systematized very well when you're doing sports training. Mike Tyson when he was preparing for his last fight, was doing these workouts where he was doing thousands of reps across multiple different movement patterns, and he was doing it right because he is a career athlete, one of the most successful in the world. Him and his coaches know how to systematize that type of a extremely high rep workout. However, when you are just training for hypertrophy, and you, for instance, hear that there is this challenge on the internet to do sets of 100 push-ups each day, right? Try to do multiple sets of 100 push-ups, like at least 200, or like, hundreds of body weight squats, right? There's all these challenges that come out of nowhere on the internet, and suddenly every newbie wants to sign up and say, I want to see if I can do 100 push-ups or whatever. Even if you're really good at push-ups and you're used to being able to do more than like 25 of them without breaking a sweat, if you've done a set of 50 before, maybe with poor form, you might be able to handle it, especially if you are changing your technique and allowing form to break down. Your chest muscle might be able to handle it, but that doesn't mean that your nervous system, your joints, etc. are going to be able to handle it. There's going to be other limiting factors that come in, and you're going to find yourself getting very fatigued from this because doing high rep hypertrophy training is something with a very high SFR. All right, so when you are getting into extremely high reps, make sure that you are either doing them as endurance training, or if you are trying to combine hypertrophy and endurance training for a specific sport, you need to do it with the right system and strategies in place. Otherwise, just trying to do hundreds of reps of weightlifting for hypertrophy is going to be extremely fatiguing and exhausting to your system. All right. The next is certain types of high impact sports training. Just like with Mike Tyson and his combat sport, this is a sport with a high SFR. So sports like that are very high impact, like football and hockey, where there's a lot of contact. Okay, contact sports are going to have a high SFR. So you need to be making sure that you manage and modulate your energies properly, because if you were to, start connecting with other people in your training, that's going to be extremely fatiguing. All right, that's why people who do combat sports save the sparring for select occasions, especially full contact sparring, because it's extremely fatiguing. Basically, the key here is that the higher impact a sport is, the higher the fatigue in comparison to the stimulus. So any combat sports are going to have very bad SFR. Also sports like parkour and the ninja warrior training, CrossFit, any type of training where you have this sort of circuit or interval or this setup of obstacles and challenges and weights to lift. These types of competitions are very taxing and exhausting to your system. Okay, so when training for them, you need to really manage your SFR. So in other words, to conclude this list and sort of bring all of these together into one principle or law to follow, the harder and more intense and high impact and just generally brutal your training, the worse the SFR is. And the more it is going to tire you out than it is going to be making you grow and create adaptations. So when you do feel the need to do these types of more hardcore training for whatever sports or athletic goals you have, you want to carefully observe your energy levels, be looking at the amount of stimulus and gains you are getting and the amount of fatigue you are getting, as well as the other factors I've talked about: inflammation, aches and pains, tiredness and weakness and soreness and all of that stuff. All right, be monitoring your SFR and evaluating exercises, and you might find that with smart, proper training like I'm teaching you, that the fatigue is really hardly ever a problem. It's really not much of a problem at all, as long as you're doing things right. That could be the case, especially when you are young, and especially if you have good genes as well. But from time to time, you are bound to start to experience more fatigue, especially when you are really serious about athletic goals and training very hard for them and doing a lot of progressive overload. Chances are that if you are pushing yourself to your fullest potential and really trying to perform at your full potential and maxing out at the end of blocks of progressive overload as you should and giving it your all, that you're going to experience fatigue and the negative aspects of it, at least at times, like at the very end of the blocks.